It's a legend that spans 3,000 years, of a young king who died before his time, and the fates of the men who disturbed his tomb. Tutankhamun left no heirs, was forgotten by his own people, and disappeared for thousands of years, but he's become the most famous pharaoh. Known worldwide for the treasures found in his tomb and the mysterious deaths of the men involved in the discovery. More than 80 years later, science is taking a closer look and searching for new clues to uncover the secrets behind one of the most enduring legends of our time: the curse of King Tutankhamun's tomb. Cairo, a city so old, it's sometimes called the mother of the world. 1,000 years have passed since this city was founded, and time has brought some changes. But ancient Egypt still survives. In the din of a crowded bazaar, and the rhythm of a timeless dance. Not far away, tower blocks give way to pyramids. But perhaps past and present are most closely linked in the golden mask of Egypt's most famous mummy. Tutankhamun, an ancient pharaoh at the heart of a very modern mystery.
Before the discovery of the tomb, Tutankhamun was virtually unknown. The questions that people had about Tutankhamun were primarily the significance of his historical position at the end of the 18th dynasty.
Tutankhamun is sort of a strange mystery in his own right. He was very young when he came to the throne. He died very young of unknown causes. And he lived in a very sort of curious and turbulent time in ancient Egypt. And so there's a tremendous amount of romance and sort of myth that's grown up around Tutankhamun.
When Tutankhamun died in approximately 1330 BC, his body was ferried across the Nile, and his tomb hidden for secrecy. Time passed, the secret location was forgotten, and the tomb lost. It would stay that way for over 3,000 years. The rediscovery of the tomb in 1922 was hailed as a triumph, and when the treasures buried with him were brought to light, Tutankhamun became a global sensation. Archaeologists wanted to know who exactly was this pharaoh, how long did he rule, and how did he die? But soon there was another question, one that was decidedly more sinister. Why did people associated with the discovery seem to die unusual early deaths? Sudden illnesses? A suicide? A murder? Was it just coincidence or something more? For some, the answer was clear. The mummy was guarded by a curse, unleashed upon the opening of his tomb. The story of the curse has captured the popular imagination for more than 80 years. But one researcher decided to re-examine the legend and subject it to the harsh light of science. Can the curse of Tutankhamun survive the scrutiny? Melbourne is a far cry from Cairo, but the famous curse is known across the globe. Dr. Mark Nelson is an epidemiologist at Monash University, studying the causes and control of diseases. But a chance remark took him in a whole new direction.
Something my son Felix said while we were on holiday in northwest Tasmania. triggered a thing, well, perhaps it would be interesting to look at an urban myth such as the Curse of Tutankhamun and apply the research methods that I'd just learned during my PhD.
Nelson had visited the tomb, and the chance to pit his training against the legend proved irresistible.
Nobody had had a scientific look at it as opposed to simply rejecting it out of hand. So that's why I decided to use these epidemiological study methods to investigate the curse. The interesting thing is that if you take a scientific approach to a myth, will you dispel the myth?
The first step was to learn everything he could about the curse and its purported victims. Investigating history can be difficult. Time erases much evidence. But with the help of modern technology, sometimes the past is just a click away. 430 miles from Cairo lies the Valley of the Kings, the ancient burial place for many of Egypt's pharaohs. By 1922, archaeologist Howard Carter had spent 6 frustrating years searching these limestone hills. But he wasn't the first. Europeans had begun exploring this valley in the early 1800s, lured by the reputed treasures buried with the pharaohs, only to find ancient tomb raiders had already beaten them. 3,000 years of grave robbers and archaeologists had stripped the Valley of the Kings bare. But Carter was convinced that one tomb remained undiscovered, that of a little-known pharaoh, Tutankhamun.
He couldn't be sure, of course, that the tomb was there, but the tomb of Tutankhamun was the only royal tomb of the New Kingdom that should have been in the valley but had never been found. He was also going on a series of clues that pinpointed this small rectangle in the Valley of the Kings that had never been excavated. So he was banking on the fact that this was really the last unexplored section of the valley.
Carter had some help in his search, the wealthy Lord Carnarvon. But as seasons passed with no sign of the tomb, Carnarvon became increasingly despondent, and in 1922 he decided to stop digging.
And Carter persuaded him to try one more season, and it was during that very last season that, of course, Carter made the most fabulous discovery probably in all of archaeology.
On the 4th of November 1922, Carter and his team uncovered a step. They dug down a further 16 steps to a door covered in plaster. Behind the door, a tunnel filled in with rocks. To the team's dismay, it appeared that a passage had already been cleared through the rocks and then refilled. Had tomb raiders already stolen whatever was inside? The men worked quickly, pulling rocks from the tunnel, heading deeper underground until they came to a second door. Nervously, Carter knocked a small hole in the upper left-hand corner. He lit a candle to test for dangerous fumes, then widened the hole and looked in. Behind him waited Carnarvon, his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, and an assistant, Arthur Callender. When Carnarvon asked if he could see anything, Carter could only reply, "Yes, wonderful things."
The finding was stupendous. It was the most major archaeological find of that century, or perhaps any century.
The discovery of the tomb caused enormous excitement, primarily because it was the only virtually intact royal burial ever discovered in the valley. And with the objects pouring out of the tomb, it soon became clear that it was an enormously wealthy and lavish burial.
The corridor into the tomb led to just 4 small rooms, but they were laden with treasure. Golden statues, ornately carved furniture, even disassembled chariots covered in gold. It would take years to fully catalogue and preserve everything. On the 17th of February 1923, the team formally entered the burial chamber to reveal a magnificent shrine. A solid gold coffin and a mummy would later be found inside.
The public went berserk over this tomb. Not only do you have a young pharaoh, the boy king, but you've got everywhere the glint of gold. More gold than anybody had ever seen. The multiple coffins, the beauty of the objects, and also sort of the mystery of what happened to this king.
Carter and Carnarvon became instant celebrities, but their joy was short-lived. 7 weeks after formally opening Tutankhamun's burial chamber, Lord Carnarvon was dead. More deaths were to come. By 1922, Egypt's Valley of the Kings seemed to have no secrets left, just empty tombs and barren cliffs. But late that year, word began to spread of an amazing discovery. Howard Carter and his team had uncovered King Tutankhamun's tomb. Inside they found fabulous artifacts, many covered in gold, but according to legend, they'd also stirred up a 3,000-year-old curse. More than 80 years later, one researcher decided to re-examine the legend of the curse from a scientific perspective.
There are a number of different ways you can approach epidemiological studies. And what these studies are attempting to do is usually see what there's an association between an exposure to something and the development of a disease.
If Mark Nelson could work out who was most likely to have been exposed to a curse, he could then find out how long they lived and why they died. If the curse does exist, he should be able to see its effect on their lives.
And of course, in these circumstances, we're looking at events that took place 80 years ago. What you had to do was go to a library.
Old newspapers tell the story. Expedition sponsor Lord Carnarvon was the curse's first victim. He died just 7 weeks after the formal opening of the burial chamber. The discovery was still headline news, and the team was the toast of the archaeological world. Lord Carnarvon left the Valley of the Kings for a couple of days' rest. He would never return. The illness came quickly, an infection spreading throughout his body. When his condition deteriorated, he was rushed to Cairo. Doctors were called in. His daughter Evelyn remained by his side, but on the 5th of April 1923, Carnarvon died of pneumonia, and the legend of the curse was born.
It certainly was big news at the time because the description that this was due to a curse and that he had defiled the tomb and he had suffered the retribution.
The media was already all over this tomb because of the gold and the mystery of the young pharaoh, the boy king. So as soon as Carnarvon died, the media shifted into high gear and saw this as a direct result of a curse on this tomb. And this was the punishment of the pharaohs on Lord Carnarvon. I mean, it makes a romantic sort of tale that supposedly on the night that Carnarvon died, the lights all went out in Cairo, and his dog started crying and fell over dead. And there were all these mysterious things that happened in connection with the death of Carnarvon, and this was just the beginning of this, horrible curse against anyone who worked in the tomb.
Soon reports came in of a number of other deaths, which appeared to have only one thing in common. 6 months after Carnarvon died, his half-brother Aubrey succumbed to infection following minor surgery. Arthur Mace, Carter's close assistant, had to stop working because of failing health. He died of pleurisy before the tomb was cleared. In 1926, French Egyptologist Georges Benedi fell while visiting the tomb and died soon afterwards. An Egyptian prince was shot after seeing the discovery. Egyptologist James Henry Breasted died of a bacterial infection. American railroad tycoon George J. Gould caught a cold in the tomb and died of pneumonia. Howard Carter's personal secretary, Richard Bethel, died of a heart attack. A short while later, Bethel's father wrote a note stating, "I really cannot stand any more horrors," then committed suicide by jumping out of a window. Newspapers highlighted the link to the tomb, no matter how tenuous. By 1934, according to some papers, more than 20 people had fallen victim to the curse. How many more deaths would the curse be responsible for? Mark Nelson's next step was to focus on the tomb. He started with the artifacts found inside. Could they hold evidence of a curse? Despite the wealth in the tomb, some historians were disappointed by the find, citing the lack of any written documents.
There are no papyri in that tomb, and very few things that are purely hard documents of history. There's a lot of material that you can draw inferences from, but it was like the most beautiful thing in the world that in some ways disappointed.
They were also puzzled by the shape and size of the tomb. Just one corridor and 4 rooms, less than 1,200 square feet in total. By contrast, the tomb of Ramesses II is 8 times larger.
When you compare the tomb of Tutankhamun to that of other pharaohs, other roughly contemporary pharaohs, his tomb is minuscule. And so it looks very clearly as if it is a non-royal tomb that was used for a royal burial.
Hoping for answers, Carter and his team carefully photographed, collected, and catalogued the tomb's treasures. Outside, crowds gathered to watch, but a legend spoke of another find, hidden away, a tablet containing a written curse, promising death to those who disturb the tomb.
If such a tablet had existed, it would have been physical evidence of a curse being placed on the tomb, and it would have given it more credence.
A cursed tablet is owned by the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, where Egyptologist Emily Teeter is based.
But this is part of a wall from a tomb built about 2400 BC, 1,000 years before Tut. And this has an actual curse. There's no question what this text is. If coming from the mouth of the man who owned the tomb, his name is Biu, and he says that anybody who comes into his tomb and desecrates the tomb will be seized by the neck like a bird in the necropolis. So in other words, his neck will be wrung, he'll be killed.
Found in relatively few tombs, Egyptian curses threaten everything from bodily harm to punishment from the gods.
The reason they did these tomb curses was there was an unfortunate tendency and practice in ancient Egypt for people to go into tombs and take the grave goods, because there would be things that they could be sold, they would want. And so when people built tombs, they knew that their tombs were in danger, so they'd try to protect them, but considering virtually all the tombs in ancient Egypt were robbed, they were not very effective.
Archaeologists think Tutankhamun's tomb was robbed twice, probably soon after his burial.
The robbers were looking for small portable objects that were very precious. So they were going after gold, perfume, and we think probably also textiles. And these could be easily sold on the open market.
Inside the tomb, Howard Carter found several gold rings bundled in a rag. He thought they were dropped by thieves when they were interrupted by guards, who then later filled in the passageway to the tomb. But could a cursed tablet have played a role? Howard Carter always denied rumors of a written curse.
My impression of Carter, that he was an honest, meticulous man. If he had found anything with writing on it, it would have been a major find, whether it had been a curse or any other topic.
The tombs that have curse inscriptions on them, these texts are usually quite prominent. The tomb of Tutankhamun has very little decoration in it. The burial chamber is painted, it's not even carved. There's really no place that a curse inscription could occur reasonably in that chamber.
It appears then that no evidence of a written curse ever existed. But the absence of a tablet isn't scientific proof. so Nelson continued his investigation and learned that Tutankhamun had died under suspicious circumstances. How did the young king die? And could he have been the first victim of the curse? Death, they say, came quickly to those who disturbed Tutankhamun's tomb. But if the curse exists, it seems to have behaved like a contagious disease. People entered the tomb and were exposed to the curse. They caught it, just like catching a cold, and then died. So Mark Nelson should be able to study the curse like any other contagious disease. Sensational newspaper reports claimed over 20 victims, but his job is to separate fact from fiction. Nelson needed to learn who was most likely to have been exposed to the curse, and then see if it had any effect on their lives. He knew the artifacts held no clues, but could a closer look at the scene show when the curse was most likely to affect people?
There had to be a relationship to time of exposure. Otherwise, if visiting the tomb would cause the mummy's curse, then everyone who's visited since the time it was opened in the 1920s until the present obviously would be affected. What is more likely, if there was a malevolent spirit or an infective agent or a toxic agent, then it probably would be related to the fact that when you opened the tomb, or when you opened the coffin or the sarcophagus, or when you examined the mummy, that you would be exposed to the curse.
Nelson believes there were 4 times when the curse was most likely to have been activated. When the excavation team entered the burial chamber, opened the sarcophagus, lifted the coffins, and examined the mummy.
You have to have a definition of exposure, so you can divide your people into those who are exposed to something and those who are not exposed to something.
The next step in the investigation was to find out who was present when the 4 potential exposures occurred.
What I decided to do was go back to the source document, the field diaries that were kept by Howard Carter and Arthur Mace, his assistant. And if you read through those, and also the book that he wrote shortly after discovery, called The Tomb of Tutankhamun, you can identify the people who were present there at the time that he broke the seals, opened the door, opened the coffin, and examined the mummy.
Nelson began pulling names from the records. As he did so, he found another puzzling death to consider: Tutankhamun's.
He had a very short marriage, a short life, and died young and tragically. Whether he died of natural causes or whether he met a violent death is another form of speculation.
Could the way Tutankhamun died have something to do with the origins of the curse? Could he have been its first victim? Tutankhamun was a young boy when he assumed the throne, maybe 9 years old. But all too soon, some say when he was just 18, he was dead. The combination of an early death, hurried burial, and small tomb raised many questions.
There has been some controversy suggesting that Tutankhamun was murdered.
Was it possible to prove a 3,000-year-old murder? Criminal profiler Mike King thought so.
Statistically, they're going to be a target of that aggression, and they are going to know the offender.
King argued he could unlock the mystery surrounding Tutankhamun's death using profiling techniques. He and partner Greg Cooper firmly believed the king was murdered.
People ask, how on earth could you possibly go back and examine a case 3,000 years ago? The bottom line is, when it's all said and done, it still boils down to theories based on the pieces of evidence that we were able to uncover.
They first ruled out death by accident, illness, or suicide.
It was possible that any of those scenarios could have happened. What we found, though, by examining the historical documents, that there was nothing that would have suggested that King Tut was suffering from an ailment that could have caused his death. So excluding natural causes was quite easy. The second thing that we needed to look at was the accidental death. And again, we believe that there would have been some indication to show why King Tut died unexpectedly. There is nothing in the records to show why King Tut died in the manner in which he died. And so we found ourselves shying away from the idea of an accidental death. In the area of suicide, again, there was nothing to get us past that point rather than just the theory.
The only choice left was murder.
On the opposite end,
As if profiling a modern
high-risk
case,
victim,
King ran what's called a risk
offender
continuum
is
on Tutankhamun. High-risk victims, criminals or policemen, for example, are statistically more likely to be random victims of opportunity. Low-risk victims, like housewives or children, are more likely to know their attackers and be specifically targeted by them. As a heavily guarded pharaoh, Tutankhamun would be at the lower risk end. If he was murdered, King argued, he knew his killer.
somehow in his private places he died. And so we then began to look at who is going to have access to this king at those times of day. And it had to boil down to the more intimate circle of associates.
For King, one person in particular stood out, Tutankhamun's advisor, Ai. He became pharaoh after the young man died and may have been responsible for placing Tutankhamun in the small, non-royal tomb.
The treatment of Tut was incredible in our opinion. The sloppy nature of preparing King Tut's tomb was of great importance to us. Even the slopping of the paint on the walls and on the floors of the tomb seemed very out of character for a pharaoh, and it pointed to us to some real anger and frustration, and let's just get this guy gone and out of our hair. And based on the means, the motive, and the opportunity, our opinion after examining all of those individuals involved in King Tut's inner circle would be that his prime minister, Ai, the one who promoted himself to pharaoh, would have been responsible for his death.
But did the physical evidence agree? Dr. James Harris is a retired professor of orthodontics at the University of Michigan and one of the few people still alive to have handled Tutankhamun's mummy. In 1976, Harris climbed inside the tomb as part of a project to X-ray Egyptian pharaohs.
The first thing one thinks of is, first of all, the body seems rather small, perhaps because it's been broken up. The mummy was actually broken up in the removal of the treasures, so that the mummy is not in good condition.
The goal that day was to X-ray Tutankhamun's skull. It proved surprisingly easy.
The head is broken off from the rest of the body, so we took the head and placed it in our cephalometer and took frontal and lateral X-ray views of the head of Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun still has some minor bandages around the skull itself. But I think what one thinks about is that he was extremely a very fine-featured individual, and obviously very young.
As an orthodontist, Harris paid particular attention to the teeth.
Tutankhamun had perfect teeth, the normal occlusion, as we would say in the United States.
But, he argued, they didn't belong to an 18-year-old.
Our X-rays would tend to argue that he was a little bit older than most people thought when he died, possibly 20, 21, or 22 years of age. Tutankhamun was a boy king to start, but he was not a boy king at the time that he died. I mean, he was a young adult.
Pinpointing how old Tutankhamun was when he died was significant, but could the X-rays indicate how he died? A fragment of bone inside the brain cavity raised suspicions.
Much has been said about particularly one loose fragment, which we can see right here, and this has been argued this might have been the cause of his death. The fragment was broken off, for example, if he had been struck with an instrument at the skull, or particularly the base of the skull. But our information from the people that have looked at our X-rays is this would not be the cause of death. Rather, that piece of fragment might have been the part of the mummification process when the brain was removed.
The rest of Tutankhamun's skull was intact.
You can see on the X-ray, you can see very well the plates of the cranial vaults, and there is no indication of abnormal thinning. There is no indication of fractures. Very qualified people who've looked at this material, they can come to no conclusion that this material or this X-rays indicate any way what the cause of death of Tutankhamun was.
Ultimately, we may never know why or how Tutankhamun died.
There does not seem to be any agreement on the cause of death. The body has been looked at by physicians, by radiologists, and also by enthusiasts. And so you end up getting a wide variety of different types of explanations of why he died. I think at this point there is no conclusive evidence that he was, for example, murdered. He might have been, but he may not have been murdered. For all we know, he might have gotten the flu and died. We simply don't know. And I think until there's more conclusive evidence, I prefer to say cause of death unknown.
And so another lead had been exhausted. There seemed no solid proof linking the manner of Tutankhamun's death to the curse. However he died, Tutankhamun's mummy lay undisturbed for over 3,000 years. But hundreds of people visited his tomb soon after it was opened. The question remained, who among them were the most likely to be exposed to a curse? And was it possible that something in the tomb, besides a curse, killed them? Murder, suicide, pneumonia, and other deadly ailments. For those who believe in King Tutankhamun's curse, 20 deaths are proof of its existence. Mark Nelson identified 4 occasions when the people excavating Tutankhamun's tomb were most likely to have been exposed to a curse. When they entered the burial chamber, opened the sarcophagus, lifted the coffins, and examined the mummy. Searching through Howard Carter's writings, Nelson found 25 people present at one or more of those times. The list included Lord Carnarvon and his daughter, Howard Carter, Arthur Mace, Arthur Callender, and 20 other scientists and dignitaries. All were potentially exposed to the curse. Did it shorten their lives? Nelson had to find out exactly when and how each of them died. He already knew that Lord Carnarvon died on the 5th of April, 1923, just 7 weeks after opening the burial chamber. Was it possible that something in the tomb, besides a curse, had killed Carnarvon?
There has been an effort in recent years to look at this whole idea a little bit more scientifically and getting away from an idea of a religious curse, looking if there might be another reason why some people who work with mummies died before they should have. And this has basically focused on different types of spores or molds or microbes that might be present on mummies.
Chicago's Field Museum houses several hundred mummies. Curator of the Egyptian collection is Jim Phillips.
I know not a single person that's gotten ill from working with mummies.
The very process of mummification, Phillips says, makes them safe to handle. Egyptians believed they needed their bodies in the afterlife.
Wanting to keep the body whole so that they could live this eternal life, they developed a system whereby they dried out the body to keep bacteria away from it, which would normally be destroying the flesh.
Without bacteria to eat away at the flesh, a mummy can stay preserved forever, and potentially harmful fungus or mold cannot grow.
In terms of a real idea that people who go into tombs and excavate mummies and bring them out to the museums, etc., they're going to get sick and die, no, I don't think that it's an important element in Egypt. We wouldn't still be doing it if we thought that was the case.
A theory says Carnarvon was killed by anthrax or other deadly spores left to protect the tomb.
I would say the likelihood of biological warfare is nil. If they were right, we would find people dead who went in afterwards and tried to rob the tomb, because Egyptians were doing that from the beginning of mummification. And I know of no instance that we find some dead individuals from disease found in tombs that they were trying to rob 1,000 years ago or 500 or 100 years ago.
In the end, it may all come down to Lord Carnarvon himself.
People tend to discount the fact that Carnarvon was in Egypt initially because of his very frail health. Carnarvon had had an automobile accident years before in England, and his doctor sent him to Egypt specifically for his health. And this was very common in that period, that Englishmen and women would be sent from the damp environment of England to the nice, dry, healthy climate of Luxor. And so he was there essentially as a convalescent in the first place.
In 1920s Egypt, before penicillin, even an everyday ritual could prove fatal. In Carnarvon's case, all it took was a little nick. He cut a mosquito bite while shaving, and then the cut became infected.
What happens when you break the surface of the skin, especially in the tropics or in hot climates such as that, is that the bacteria that normally live in your skin can use that opportunity to break down into the skin and infect the tissue through the skin and spread into the skin. So what probably happened in his case is that they got their way into a blood vessel and spread throughout his body through blood poisoning. The medical term for that is septicemia. This can become an overwhelming infection with a person. You become very ill. And often people under those circumstances develop pneumonia, which is an infection of the lungs. And pneumonia is often described as the old man's friend. It's the common condition which elderly men die of because their immune system, their body's all run down. So if you've got an intercurrent illness, another illness that's causing your body to be under a great deal of stress, then it is often pneumonia, the final act in the play of life.
Carnarvon's death certificate states he died from pneumonia.
There's a wonderful word, it happens to be in Yiddish, but it's called bashert. You know, it means fate. You know, sometimes fate does enter into these things. Your time to go, it's your time to go.
And so biological agents in the tomb were also ruled out. Nelson now had the information he'd been searching for. He knew the fate of the 25 people most likely to have been exposed to the curse. When he took a close look at his findings, he uncovered what he believed was the truth behind the legend. It's easy to believe that ancient powers in Egypt still hold sway. Most historians argue, however, that the truth behind the legend of Tutankhamun's curse is really very simple.
I think the curse of Tutankhamun has the same sort of appeal to the popular imagination as Elvis does. People everywhere are still hoping that Elvis might be alive somewhere, and I think they're still hoping that the curse might have some validity.
It continues, it continues, it continues. And I think part of it is people wanting even more maybe than there was with the tomb. The tremendous gold, the beautiful artifacts, the poignancy of this being a young pharaoh who died very, very young, somehow just isn't enough. People want to have more mystery and more romance.
But could the curse withstand scientific scrutiny? Mark Nelson identified 25 people who were present in King Tutankhamun's burial chamber when the sarcophagus, coffins, and mummy inside were first disturbed. If the story of a deadly curse was true, Nelson would have been able to see its effect on their lives. But learning the fates of those potentially exposed was not enough. He needed a control group. Nelson traced 11 other Westerners who were identified in Carter's writings as being in Egypt, but weren't in the tomb during the times of potential exposure. These 11 included a number of women, wives and relatives of the scientists.
I excluded the local Egyptians. The first reason is, coming from a different cultural and population, is that they would almost certainly have a different life expectancy. The other problem that you will have with the locals is the recording of births and deaths. So that's likely to be much poorer. So the best way to make sure that you could get consistent data is to actually look at the Westerners, so people who came from the United States, United Kingdom and France in the main. And under those circumstances, you can then compare the two groups to see if there's a statistically significant difference in survival.
Nelson's first surprise came when he looked at the potentially exposed group.
The exposed group, on average, survived about 21 years after they were exposed and lived to the age of 70.
For every early, unexpected death, there were those who lived for decades. Lord Carnarvon, potentially exposed to the curse during the opening of the burial chamber, died 7 weeks later. But his daughter Evelyn, who was with him that day, lived for 57 more years and died at the age of 78. Arthur Mace, potentially exposed twice, was dead within 5 years. But expedition photographer Harry Burton, with 4 potential exposures, lived for 17 years, dying at the age of 60. And Sir Alan Gardner, twice exposed, died at the age of 84, 41 years after the discovery of the tomb.
Now, if you go back into the 1920s, if I said to you that this group who were exposed to the mummy's curse, on average, lived to be 70 years old, everyone would accept that as being a normal life expectancy. So if there really was an effect of a mummy's curse, if people died shortly after exposure, then that average should be much, much lower than 70. And that's not what we saw.
The second surprise came when Nelson looked at the unexposed group. They lived for an average of 29 years after the tomb was opened and died at an average age of 75, 5 years later than the exposed group. Could the curse have had some effect after all? Nelson didn't think so.
There were more women in the unexposed group and they were a younger age. Women on average live in Western societies 6 to 7 years longer than men. If you take away the differences due to age and due to gender, then there was no statistically significant difference between the two. And the fact that these people lived 20 to 30 years afterwards to an average of 70 and 75 years respectively suggests that there was no physical entity called the mummy's curse.
Perhaps the most compelling argument against the curse was Howard Carter.
He was there during all aspects of the original discovery, the breaking of the tomb, all parts of the exploitation of the tomb. So if there was anyone who would be earmarked for death, it would be Howard Carter.
Carter died in 1939 at the age of 64. 16 years after lighting a candle and looking back into history. Nelson's findings were published in the British Medical Journal in 2002, but he knows that myth can be much more fun and frightening than fact.
I think that it'll live on, in spite of what I've said. And the reason is that the existence of the myth has nothing to do with the facts of the case. It's the way that society looks at them. Even though this person's been buried for 3,500 years, we have defiled his body and burial place, and therefore something should happen to us.
Despite science, the legend of King Tutankhamun's curse will live on in the story of Lord Carnarvon's death and the tales of those who crossed paths with an ancient pharaoh and died before their time.